Today's been amazing. Like, I've learned a ton from all the speakers, and it's so rare that we as researchers, I know not all of you are researchers, we'll get to that, get a chance to get together and like nerd out on this stuff. It's super fun. And I've learned a lot, and I've changed the way I think about a lot of stuff. So thank you all to that. And I should start off by saying, this talk has a very aspirational title. I don't really know the secret to attaining like God-like influence at your organization as a researcher, but I thought that, like, this is something I think about a lot, and I thought that today was like a really awesome opportunity to like share some of that thinking and like get you all thinking about it, because I think we're sort of at the cusp of the moment. I don't know. Today kind of feels like that. Anybody else? Yeah, feels like a cusp of a moment. It's great. So, I'm going to talk about a few things. I'm going to start off by telling you a little bit about where I'm coming from. And then I'll talk a little bit about the relationship between research and design, and that's where things will get really weird and tense and a little awkward. But hey, I promised a hot take. I got to deliver on a hot take. But ultimately, I want to tie that together and share my perspective on how research can and maybe should lead, particularly within a product organization. So I'll start here. So I started off my research career at NPR. It was awesome to hear Shanice talk about CBC. I totally related to like the scrappiness you have to employ when you work in public broadcasting, where they like pay you in coffee mugs and tote bags. Like, I totally felt all that. But it was so true. It's like, I never had a problem recruiting participants. People were like, oh, yeah, I'll go to NPR. That's awesome. So it has its benefits, right? And after that, I really sharpened my usability chops with a couple of years spent at the digital agency Huge. Did a lot of usability testing. I spent more time in the lab than like a weekly basis than I probably ever want to do again. A little real talk for you. And then I worked at Facebook, where I worked on the ads product, something that's never been involved in anything controversial at all. And now I work at Airbnb, where I think Alec gave me a little bit of a promotion. I actually don't lead the entire research team, but I lead the team that's focused on improving the host experience at Airbnb. And a few months ago, I was lucky enough to be invited onto Ariel's show, and my team was super stoked, and they're like, oh, that's a great podcast. Can't wait to hear what you have to say. And they tuned in to hear me blather on about my time at Facebook. So I was like, let me make good on that. I'm going to talk a little bit about Airbnb. And what makes it so special is a place to do research, because I think that's helpful context for the stuff that I'm going to talk about a little bit later. So I'll do that by going way back a little bit. So this is where it all started. First off, who knows sort of the origin story roughly of Airbnb? Damn. All right. Bear with me. All right, you don't. Great. Great. This is for you. So this is the first Airbnb. Two of the three co-founders, Joe and Brian, were living here in San Francisco, and they were unemployed wannabe entrepreneurs. They were designers by training. They went to RISD together. And the rent got jacked up, something that happens in San Francisco quite a bit. And they knew, because they were designers, that a design conference was coming to town, and they knew that all the hotels were sold out. So they got the bright idea, that was actually more like desperation at the time, to rent out some room on their floors to people coming to the conference. So they bought some airbeds, and 3 guests to the conference booked spots on their airbeds. And these are the first 3 guests on Airbnb ever, Kat, Amal, and Michael. We have their posters up everywhere at work. And the name of this new product seems stunningly obvious to them. It's like Airbed and Breakfast. And I can't tell you how many times people have been like, oh, Airbed. Oh, that's the name. So they're like, okay, cool. This could be a company. Let's give it a shot. So they slapped this name on a website. Look at that. Beautiful, right? And they were in business. But things were actually really slow to get started. And these are the 3 co-founders, Joe, Nate, Brian, lovely, lovely guys. And they love to tell the story about those early days when things were just like really slow to get moving. And nobody was traveling on the site, nobody was hosting on the site, they didn't know what the problem was. So they went to one of their mentors, the investor, Paul Graham. And Paul said 4 words to them that have since been sort of enshrined at the company. And what Paul said to them was, go to your users. So that very night, Brian and Joe got on an airplane and flew to New York, which is where most people were hosting on Airbnb at the time. And they started interviewing hosts. And they would get on the phone back to Nate, who's still in San Francisco, and share product insights and say, hey, we need to fix X, Y, Z. And Nate would code away and make the changes. And they credit this with the company taking off. So this mindset has really carried over into the business today. And this is Brian, one of the co-founders and the current CEO. And Brian sometimes sends short notes to the entire company on Sunday nights, calls them the Sunday Night Series. And this is a quote from one of those emails. And he was talking a little bit about Walt Disney and how Walt Disney would obsessively walk the park to understand the guest experience at Disneyland. And I can't tell you how awesome it is to have your CEO of a giant tech company send something like this out to the entire company as a user researcher. The entire research team like freaked out. We were like, yes! That's what we're talking about. Like, take that, data science. I love you, data science partners out there watching this on YouTube 2 weeks from now. I don't know. They're not going to watch it. So this mindset has carried over into the business today. So the research team at Airbnb walks the park all the time. This is me and my colleague Catherine, very chilly on a dock in Nantucket after we'd spent the day visiting and interviewing property managers of luxury homes, places I will never be able to afford to rent. It was an unbelievable experience. So, and yeah, we thought that the best way to send updates back to the team was by doing fun little video updates. So that's exactly what we did. So in some sense, that trip to New York never really ended. And this is a quote in the New York Times a couple weeks ago when we announced the new product called Airbnb Plus. Did anybody hear about the new product? All right, right on, cool. And this quote here references the research team's work. Even though I should point out that the word team here actually refers to Catherine from the previous slide. Catherine really worked hard on this product for the last year and a half and did amazing, amazing work to make sure that the entire program was informed by actual experiences of our hosts and the actual needs of our hosts. So the research team at Airbnb, pretty big as research teams go. We're about 38 people. We have 4 people on a research ops team who help us with participant recruiting, vendor relationships, processes. We have a 4-person survey science team. So they provide horizontal support across the entire product organization to make sure that we're producing really rigorous and high-quality survey work. And we also have a product specialist organization of about 15 people who own all inbound customer feedback channels and work together with researchers to make sure that we synthesize all that input together. So it's unique. It's a really, I'm super lucky to do this type of work at this place, and I'm very aware of that. So how is it so different from other technology companies, especially, previous employers not to be named, like not all CEOs send emails like that one to the entire company, right? Talking about how important it is to understand the needs of real people. So how is it so different? I actually credit Brian's training as a designer with a lot of this, right? And I think that has really created an incredible culture of research, which makes the first slide of this second section a little awkward to say. And that's this. And if this sounds a little bizarre and random, I guess that's the point, right? And I promised a hot take, and there it is. There's your hot take. I'm going to back up a little bit, and I'm going to talk a little bit about why I think this is true. So, and before I go any further, a quick reminder. I know there are a lot of you out there Research is a part of design at Airbnb, and I love my design partners. They're the best. But here's the thing. None of them could teach me R. None of them could teach me how to compute non-response bias in survey data. None of them could teach me how to run a regression. And my point is this. People go to school for years for this shit. I didn't, but yeah, right? Right? Is that Sam? I knew that was you. All right. But the idea of a designer trying to elevate the craft of a Sam Ladner is crazy to me. Do you agree? Putting you on the spot. Humbly, yes. Great, because it's true. I mean, we should own that, right? And the more I think about this relationship between the two disciplines, the more it seems a little bit arbitrary to me, to be honest. So I want to spend some time teasing that relationship apart. So there's obviously a historic relationship here, right? And pioneers in UX research probably just called themselves designers, right? They just thought research was one component of what they were doing. And this is still the reality in many organizations. It's probably the reality in a lot of your organizations. And you know what? That's great. Like, far be it from me to say otherwise. Whatever the needs of the business are is what should determine sort of the model you use, right? But at my past X number of jobs, my entire career, this has not been true. And I think there's been an evolution of our discipline that doesn't really get talked about that much. And that evolution looks like this. Do you know how many UX researchers there are at Facebook? Over 300. Google has so many they've lost count. I asked somebody, and they were like, but their guess was somewhere over 500. That's bananas, right? And I asked folks on Twitter a few weeks back how big their teams were. People just doing research, not doing design and dabbling in research. And the diversity of the responses in terms of like the type of company and the size of the teams was amazing to me. And now this is at least partly because huge companies can afford a higher degree of specialization, right? And that is a fact, and it's a total luxury. But the interesting thing about it is this. I think the people who end up in the research role in a world like this are trained researchers, they're career researchers, and most of them have never designed a thing in their life. So the reality today is that both of these models for doing UX research exist today. There's a more generalist model, there's a more specialist model, and they exist on a spectrum, right? And that's a good thing, I think. Like I said, ultimately, the needs of the organization should determine the model that makes the most sense. And that's probably what's behind, speaking of hot takes like this. I've hidden the tweeter's name to protect him from a room full of angry researchers, but it reads this. It's probably pretty small, at least for me. I've never understood the need for a specialized design research role. A designer should know how to collect insights about how users engage with a product or service. Additionally, a designer should be able to synthesize those insights and visualize solutions to solve problems. You know what? Sure, great. Like, that totally makes sense. If you live in a generalist world, that totally makes sense, and I'm totally on board. So, these models coexist. That's confusing, but it's a fact. And I want to talk a little bit about the right side of the spectrum here. Because I will say this. I think, unarguably, the right side of the spectrum is preferable and is better and produces better work. I will defend that till my dying breath. And maybe I will do that this afternoon. So how do we exert leadership in a world like this as a discipline? That's a tough nut to crack, right? And it's tough because of one particular complicating dynamic, and that's this. Even in a specialized or specialist model, the relationship between the disciplines tends to look like this. Sometimes there's a dotted line relationship between design and research, and sometimes it's even more formal, like researchers report to designers. Why is that? I don't know, Ryan. I don't know. I mean, and by the way, it's totally coincidental that 2 out of 2 gifts so far have been Canadians. And I totally ruined that with my gifts later on in the presentation. Should have gotten 100%. Oh well. But if we've evolved from research just being one component of design, what's with that parent-child relationship? Why is it almost always design making strategic decisions about the direction of a product, setting a profound product vision for their teams, while researchers keep their heads down in the lab? I thought a bit about why this might be, and as I was doing that, I tried to start by asking myself, what are some good reasons you might want to pair organizations, or pair disciplines organizationally if they feel discrete and different from one another? You might want to do this if they share a deeply related set of skills, if one is explicitly a support function of the other, if there's a natural or common career progression from one to the other, or if there's a strong mutual need for one another's output, or if there's a common metric for success, maybe like different types of sales teams organized together because of this reason. But thing is, most of these don't describe the relationship between research and design, in my perspective. I mean, I think the fourth one here is probably the only debatable one. I think you could argue that, yeah, there's a strong mutual need between the output of a research team and the output of a design team. But you could probably say that about the relationship between design and engineering, right? Does that mean you should pair them organizationally? I don't think that would make a ton of sense. So, I don't know. Yeah, American, screwed it up. So this relationship feels a little bit like an artifact of the past to me. But I'm not interested in coming off like I have a chip on my shoulder and I'm bitter. What I am interested in doing is starting a conversation about research as a leadership function, right? So, let's do that. So if this is the state of the world, what's keeping researchers from stepping up a little bit? I, like a good researcher, asked a bunch of people. I went out and did some scrappy research. And people floated a few theories to me. And this is what they had to say. First, they said, could just be a carryover from that generalist model. People aren't used to thinking of research as a standalone thing. Could be that researchers as people are not necessarily the type to be bold, to stand up, to be ambitious like that, and to try to set a profound vision. And the third, which I thought was really funny, which might be true, who knows, is that researchers just like doing research too much. We get into this work because we like the practice of it, and we're curious people, and that feeds something in us. So, I don't know. But here's the thing, like despite that legacy relationship that I obviously have many feels about, the important thing is this. This is most definitely not a reflection of how research actually does its thing within the context of a cross-functional product organization. This is the reality of how research does its thing, right? We are a peer function to all these other teams focused on a singular goal. That's right. And in fact, you know, like we're so well positioned here. Like, think about it. Boom. Oh, how do you like that? Now's the time. Oops. Now take a picture. But think about it, right? Like, this statement, I think, would be totally non-controversial to any of your peers. I also think that the second statement would be totally non-controversial. I mean, think about it. Like, cycle through the core competencies of all of your partners, if you're a researcher. Who among them has a more informed perspective on what your users need than you do? So we're well positioned to lead, that's great. But what does leadership actually look like? What sort of behavior should we adopt, right? And I think that when people think about this, when they think about their own professional career, they tend to think of things that are trappings of leadership or outcomes of leadership or are just like correlated but not causal necessarily, to put it in our lingo. So I'll start with like this useless stuff that a lot of people tend to associate with leadership and that I feel like I sometimes have to coach people on my teams about. Leadership is not attending more meetings. I sometimes say that I spent the first half of my career trying to get in more meetings, and I'm going to spend the second half trying to get out of them. Leadership is not a title. Leadership is not managing people. Leadership takes a ton of forms, And it can look like this. These are some critical components. To be a leader, you have to think long-term, you have to have a strong point of view, and you have to speak up, and you have to own your expertise, right? So let's talk some examples. Here's one thing not to do, and I know you shouldn't do it because I did it. So this is a great example of missing an opportunity. So I was the researcher on this project. This is the first thing I worked on at Facebook. And it's a pretty simple mechanism, right? Promoted posts are basically the idea, like if you're an admin of a Facebook page and you create a post, you can pay a couple bucks to boost the distribution of that post. And that little bit of UI you see, that's what I chose to concern myself with. And I got a whole bunch of people into the lab, did a bunch of usability studies, and spoke to a bunch of small business owners because they were the primary target here. And the interaction of the product itself was simple. Like, they got it. It's like, look at it. It's like two buttons, one button. They're like, yeah, all right. But as I was talking to them, they talked about things that really illustrated that they didn't get how Facebook worked and how their Facebook page worked. I think now, due to a lot of unfortunate events, we all sort of have an intuitive understanding that like our news feed is not necessarily reverse chronological order, right? And if you are an admin of a page, not everybody who likes your page is going to see every post. But people were asking that. In the interviews, people were like, wait, this seems to imply that not everybody who likes my page sees my stuff. And I chose not to concern myself with that. I didn't raise the flag, which was dumb. But we shipped it, and that very thing turned into a meme in the press. And we spent months battling it. And I was like, good job, Matt. Like, you had it right there. But it felt out of my swim lane, right? I felt like I didn't have the expertise. I felt like I was in this company that valued big data, and like, would people take this seriously? They should have. I should have. So that's an example of how research can miss the boat on leadership. Ah, well, look at that. Old version of the deck, so I'll talk through it. I just wanted to make sure I had a really good one, right? They don't exist. No, that's not true. There are just too many to pick. So a great example of research demonstrating leadership actually comes from Airbnb. There's a team at Airbnb called the Trust Team, and they deal with all the gnarly, complicated stuff that happens in a marketplace product, right? And there are two brilliant researchers on that team, Natalie Tulsiani and Esther Burton. And Natalie and Esther have demonstrated leadership through their research in a bunch of ways. One example is throughout the course of their day-to-day work, doing interviews with hosts and with guests, they detected some patterns that wasn't necessarily the focus of their work in the first place, about the types of guests and the types of listings that can be scammy, right? If you haven't used Airbnb, don't be scared. This is so rare, and you're more likely to get struck by lightning than like fall for a scam listing on Airbnb. But in our perspective, one is too many, right? So they're working on this problem. So what they did was basically generate a persona of a type of listing that is likely to be a scam listing. And they generated a persona of a user, a guest, who is likely to get scammed. And they handed those observations over to data science. Data science didn't validate those models. They tried to falsify those models. They couldn't. And as a result, on the roadmap for the team is a whole bunch of fascinating machine learning work that's going to warn people about potential for scams. And it's going to cut down on all these terrible things that can happen, even though, like I said, it's super rare. So it happens. Research as leadership happens, just not enough. And I think it happens because we're uniquely positioned as a practice to do it. And I have more good news for you, right? Like, if you're a researcher, you, by your nature, have some great leadership characteristics. You're curious, you're dispassionate, you're comfortable with ambiguity. Somebody called that out today, didn't they? Oh, it was Ariel. She was like, don't tell me to not be comfortable with ambiguity or whatever. Sorry, Ariel. So, What holds us back? These are the things that we talked about earlier, but I just wanted to use my time today to say, look, it's on each of us to squash all of these perceptions, right? And in a couple of years, I'd love to come back to this conference when it's 5 times as big, right? And check in with one another and see how we're doing on this front. Because like I said, I feel like we're at sort of a tipping point moment as a practice, and as a function, and as a discipline. And if we do this, if we do step up, it's going to mean better products and better services for the people that we build for, and that's ultimately why we're here, right? So let's do this. Thanks very much.